Dr. Sarah adjusted her containment suit one final time before entering the quarantine chamber aboard the massive Galactic Council station orbiting 442b. Through the reinforced viewport, she could see the delegation of alien representatives maintaining what they clearly considered a safe distance from her modest research facility. Their translator devices buzzed with nervous chatter in dozens of languages she couldn't understand, but their body language spoke volumes about their terror. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she stood, a lone human among representatives of 17 different spacefaring civilizations, and they were all afraid of what she carried in her small travel case. Ambassador of the Hegemony approached first, his chitinous carapace clicking nervously as his multiple eyes fixed on Sarah's case. They were known throughout the galaxy as fearsome warriors, their natural armor and razor-sharp claws making them formidable opponents in any conflict. Yet this particular warrior was visibly trembling. "Human Sarah," his translator crackled, "the Galactic Council has reviewed your request to establish a research colony on the contested moon of Prime. Your species shows promise for inclusion in our alliance, but there is one matter of grave concern that must be addressed before we can proceed." Sarah nodded respectfully. "I'm here to answer any questions you might have, Ambassador." The reptilian delegate stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Her scales had shifted to a pale yellow, which Sarah had learned indicated extreme anxiety in their species. "Doctor, our deep space scouts have reported disturbing intelligence about your. They describe creatures of unimaginable horror that your people somehow coexist with. Creatures so deadly that even our most advanced biotechnology cannot provide adequate protection against their venom." "The reports speak of tiny monsters," added the crystalline ethereal known as Harmony of Spheres, their voice resonating through the chamber like wind chimes in a storm. "Beings no larger than a claw, yet capable of killing creatures 1,000 times their size within mere moments. Our scouts describe them as having 8 legs, multiple eyes, and the ability to produce webs stronger than our finest battle armor." Sarah's heart sank as she realized what had happened. The Galactic Council's first contact scouts must have encountered Earth's wildlife and completely misunderstood what they were seeing. She thought of her research notes and the small terrarium she'd brought as part of her presentation, wondering how she could possibly explain the truth to beings who had clearly never encountered anything like Earth's biodiversity. "They leap incredible distances," continued a floating gas bag creature she didn't recognize, "and can inject neurotoxins that shut down nervous systems in seconds. I calculate that just 3 or 4 of these creatures could theoretically wipe out an entire starship crew." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the chamber made Sarah's stomach clench. She was beginning to understand why her application for colony rights had been under review for over 2 standard years. Ambassador's claws scraped against the metal floor as he shifted his weight. "Doctor, we must ask directly, why does humanity choose to share their world with such nightmarish creatures? Are they weapons, some form of biological warfare that your species has learned to control?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either doom humanity's chances of joining the galactic community or open up an entirely new understanding between species. "Ambassadors, honored delegates, I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about Earth's ecosystem and humanity's relationship with it." She slowly opened her travel case, causing several of the smaller delegates to actually flee toward the chamber's exits. Inside, nestled in a carefully climate-controlled terrarium, sat a small jumping spider named Newton, barely larger than a child's thumbnail. His iridescent chelicerae caught the chamber's artificial light as he went about the simple business of being a spider, completely unaware that his presence was causing a diplomatic crisis. "This is Newton," Sarah said gently, her voice carrying the warm affection she'd always had for her research subjects. "He's a audax, commonly known as a bold, jumping spider. He's been my research companion for 3 years now, and before that his ancestors shared the same relationship with humans for thousands of years." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. Several delegates had backed so far away that they were pressed against the walls, while others had activated personal force fields that cast rainbow patterns across their terrified forms. Translator stuttered before managing to process her words. "Research. Companion, you travel with this death dealer willingly." "Newton isn't a death dealer," Sarah explained, carefully lifting the terrarium so the delegates could see more clearly. "He's intelligent, curious, and remarkably gentle. Jumping spiders like Newton are among Earth's most skilled hunters, but they pose no threat to humans. In fact, they're beneficial to us. They hunt the insects that might otherwise damage our food supplies or spread disease. Ambassador's multiple eyes blinked in rapid succession, a sign Sarah had learned indicated deep confusion in. But our scouts reported venom capable of killing large organisms within moments. The scouts weren't wrong about the venom, Sarah acknowledged. Newton's bite can indeed be lethal to insects and small creatures, but human physiology is different. A jumping spider's venom might cause some local irritation to a human, similar to a bee sting, but nothing more serious than that. We're simply too large for their venom to be effective against us. She paused, watching as Newton explored a small artificial plant in his terrarium, his movements precise and purposeful. But more importantly, jumping spiders like Newton rarely bite anything larger than their normal prey unless they're directly threatened. They're actually quite shy and prefer to avoid confrontation. "This makes no sense," declared the gas bag creature, who Sarah now recognized as a based on their vocal patterns. "Our analyses showed that these creatures possess intelligence comparable to some spacefaring species. Why would an intelligent predator choose to coexist peacefully with potential prey?" Sarah smiled, the expression lost on most of the alien delegates, but somehow conveying warmth even through the translation barriers. "That's where human uniqueness comes into play, and it's something I think the Galactic Council would find very valuable in an alliance partner." She activated a holographic display that showed images of Earth's diverse ecosystems, focusing on the countless examples of different species living in complex, interconnected relationships. Humans didn't evolve as the apex predator on our world. We developed intelligence, tool use, and social cooperation partly as a response to living alongside thousands of other intelligent or semi-intelligent species. We learned to coexist, to understand other forms of consciousness, and to find mutual benefit in relationships with beings very different from ourselves. The images shifted to show humans working alongside various animals. Dogs helping with hunting and protection, cats controlling rodent populations in human settlements, birds warning of approaching predators, even dolphins assisting with fishing. "We call it symbiosis," Sarah continued, nodding with satisfaction that several delegates had inched closer to get a better look at the display. "Humans have formed beneficial relationships with hundreds of species on our world. We've learned to communicate with, understand, and work alongside creatures with completely different forms of intelligence and consciousness." Newton chose that moment to perform one of his characteristic hunting jumps, leaping from his plant to capture a fruit fly that had somehow made its way into his terrarium. The movement was so quick and precise that several delegates jumped backward, but Sarah just smiled. "Newton's people have been living alongside my people for thousands of years," she said softly. "They help us by controlling harmful insects, and we help them by providing stable habitats and protection from their natural predators. Neither species dominates the other. We simply coexist." Ambassador's claws had stopped scraping the floor, and his posture had shifted to what Sarah recognized as intense curiosity rather than fear. "Doctor, are you suggesting that humanity has naturally developed the diplomatic and skills necessary for multi-species cooperation?" "I'm suggesting," Sarah replied, "that what your scouts saw as humanity's greatest threat might actually be our greatest strength. We've already proven we can live peacefully with hundreds of different forms of consciousness. We've developed instinctive understanding of non-human intelligence and behavior patterns. We've learned to find the benefits in relationships with beings that other species might see only as threats or competitors." She gestured to Newton, who had settled down to methodically clean his legs after his successful hunt. "Your people see a terrifying monster because they've never had to learn to look deeper. Humans see Newton as an individual with his own personality, preferences, and behavioral patterns. We see intelligence that works differently from ours but is no less valid." Scales had shifted from pale yellow to a curious green. "This changes our understanding significantly. If humans have indeed developed natural diplomatic skills through coevolution with multiple intelligent species, then perhaps," Ambassador finished, "humanity might be exactly what the Galactic Council needs to resolve some of our more intractable interspecies conflicts." Sarah nodded, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since entering the chamber. "We'd be honored to help, ambassadors. And I think Newton would be happy to serve as an example of how different forms of consciousness can work together for mutual benefit. The chamber buzzed with excited translation chatter as the various delegates began discussing this new perspective among themselves. Sarah noticed that while they still maintained respectful distances from Newton's terrarium, the body language of fear was gradually being replaced by curiosity and something that might even be called wonder. She had a feeling that this was just the beginning of a much longer and more interesting conversation than anyone had anticipated. 3 standard days had passed since Sarah's initial presentation to the Galactic Council, and word of the human who traveled with deadly creatures as companions had spread throughout the station. What had started as a simple colony application hearing had evolved into something unprecedented. The first comprehensive study of human-animal relationships ever conducted by the galactic community. Sarah found herself in the station's largest conference chamber, surrounded by diplomatic specialists and behavioral scientists from across the galaxy. Newton's terrarium sat at the center of the room, now accompanied by carefully controlled holographic displays showing Earth's ecosystem in unprecedented detail. Doctor, the galaxy's leading expert in psychology, had arrived that morning from the research colonies. They were known for their analytical minds and their complete lack of emotional responses to danger, making them ideal for studying phenomena that terrified other species. Even they, however, had requested that Newton be kept in a containment field during the examination. Doctor, synthesized voice carried the mechanical precision typical of their species. We have reviewed your preliminary data on human-arachnid relationships with considerable interest. However, our models suggest that what you describe should be impossible. Predator species do not typically form emotional bonds with potential prey species, and prey species do not typically display affectionate behaviors toward predators. Sarah smiled, recognizing the challenge in the scientist's words. Doctor, I think the fundamental error in your models is the assumption that humans and spiders exist in a predator-prey relationship. We don't. We exist in what we call a commensal relationship, where both species benefit but in different ways. She activated a new set of holographic displays showing detailed behavioral studies of humans interacting with various spider species. Newton's species, for instance, provides pest control services that benefit human agriculture and health. In return, humans provide stable habitats, protection from larger predators, and sometimes direct care. Direct care? Ambassador had become a regular attendee at these sessions, his initial terror replaced by scientific curiosity. You care for these creatures as individuals. Would you like to see? Sarah asked, nodding the subtle shift in body language that indicated the delegates were ready for a more direct demonstration. Without waiting for an answer, she carefully opened Newton's terrarium and extended her hand. Newton immediately jumped onto her palm, his tiny legs tickling her skin as he explored this familiar territory. The reaction from the assembled delegates was immediate and dramatic. Several smaller species activated emergency personal shields, while the larger ones backed away so quickly that 2 actually collided with each other in their haste to put distance between themselves and the monster that was now freely roaming on a human's unprotected hand. Newton recognizes me, Sarah explained calmly, allowing the spider to walk up her arm to his preferred perch on her shoulder. We've developed what humans call a bond of trust. He knows I won't harm him, and I know he won't harm me. Doctor's mechanical voice carried a note of what might have been amazement. Doctor, our sensors indicate that the creature's chemical signatures are consistent with what we would classify as contentment and security. This contradicts everything we understand about arachnid psychology. That's because you've never encountered arachnids that evolved alongside a social species like humans, Sarah replied. Newton's ancestors learned thousands of years ago that humans represent safety and resources rather than threats. Over generations, both species adapted to this relationship. She gently stroked Newton's abdomen with one finger, causing the small spider to settle more comfortably on her shoulder. Newton actually seeks out human contact when he's stressed or uncomfortable. It's a learned behavior that helps him regulate his emotional state. Who had been silent throughout the demonstration, suddenly spoke up. Emotional state? Doctor, are you claiming that these creatures experience emotions? All evidence suggests they do, Sarah nodded. Not in the same way humans do, of course, but they demonstrate clear preferences, form attachments to individuals, show signs of distress when separated from familiar environments, and exhibit what we can only describe as curiosity about new experiences. To demonstrate her point, Sarah activated a small laser pointer, creating a tiny red dot on the floor of the chamber. Newton's response was immediate and dramatic. His entire body oriented toward the dot, his multiple eyes tracking its movement with intense focus. When Sarah moved the dot in quick patterns across the floor, Newton followed along with obvious excitement, his jumping behaviors becoming more animated and playful. "He's playing," breathed Harmony of Spheres, their crystalline form resonating with what Sarah had learned was their expression of wonder. "This predator is engaging in play behavior." "Newton loves this game," Sarah confirmed, moving the dot in increasingly complex patterns that Newton attempted to follow and capture. "He's learned that the red dot isn't real prey, but he enjoys the challenge of trying to catch it anyway. It's pure entertainment for him." The assembled delegates watched in fascination as Newton performed increasingly acrobatic leaps and bounds, clearly enjoying himself as he pursued the uncatchable dot. His movements were precise and beautiful, demonstrating the incredible athletic abilities that had initially terrified the galactic community. Dr. Sensors were working overtime, recording every aspect of Newton's behavior and chemical signatures. "Doctor, our analysis indicates that the creature is experiencing what we can only classify as joy. This level of emotional complexity in a species of this size should not be possible according to our current understanding of neural development." "Earth's biodiversity challenges a lot of assumptions," Sarah agreed, finally turning off the laser pointer and allowing Newton to settle down. "We have with distributed intelligence systems, corvids that use tools and solve complex puzzles, dolphins with their own languages and cultural traditions, and elephants that appear to experience grief and ceremony around death." She paused, nodding the intense interest in the room. "But perhaps most importantly for the Galactic Council, we have thousands of examples of different species learning to communicate across the barriers of biology and consciousness. Humans haven't just learned to coexist with other intelligent life forms. We've learned to understand them." Ambassador stepped closer, his fear having completely transformed into scientific curiosity. "Doctor, would it be possible to demonstrate this communication? Can you actually communicate with this Newton creature?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Not in the way you might think of communication. Newton doesn't use language as we understand it, but we do exchange information." She gently removed Newton from her shoulder and placed him back in his terrarium, then retrieved a small container from her research kit. Inside were several different types of small insects, fruit flies, crickets, and tiny moths. "Newton prefers fruit flies over other prey," she explained, "but he'll eat crickets when he's particularly hungry, and he finds moths challenging and interesting to hunt. Watch his behavior when I offer him choices." Sarah placed one of each insect type near Newton's position in the terrarium. Newton's response was immediate and clear. He oriented toward the fruit fly first, but then noticed the moth. After a moment of what could only be described as consideration, he chose the moth, approaching it with the careful, deliberate movements of a hunter engaging with challenging prey. "He's making a decision," observed a delegate Sarah hadn't met before, a tall, ethereal being whose species seemed to be composed primarily of organized energy fields. "This is not instinctive behavior. This is active choice-making." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And because I've observed Newton for years, I can predict his choices with about 70% accuracy based on his recent feeding patterns, activity levels, and environmental factors. I understand his personality well enough to anticipate his decisions." Doctor's mechanical voice carried what might have been excitement. "Doctor, you've essentially described a functional translation protocol for non-verbal consciousness. If humans have developed this capability naturally through co-evolution with multiple species, then humans might be capable of establishing communication protocols with any intelligent species they encounter," Ambassador finished, "including species that other civilizations have been unable to communicate with effectively." Sarah felt a thrill of excitement as she realized where this conversation was leading. "Are there species the Galactic Council has had difficulty establishing diplomatic relations with?" The chamber fell silent for a long moment. Finally spoke, her scales shifting to patterns Sarah had learned indicated careful consideration of dangerous topics. "Doctor," she said slowly, "there are several species the Council has encountered that appear to be intelligent and potentially peaceful, but whose forms of consciousness are so alien that we've been unable to establish meaningful contact. We've been unable to determine whether they're simply ignoring us, don't understand our attempts at communication, or are actively hostile. There are also species we've inadvertently offended or frightened through cultural misunderstandings," added Harmony of Spheres. "Species whose psychology and social structures are so different from our own that traditional diplomatic protocols have failed completely." Ambassador's multiple eyes focused intently on Sarah. "Doctor, if humanity truly possesses natural diplomatic skills, would your species be willing to assist the Galactic Council in establishing communication with these problematic contacts?" Sarah looked at Newton, who was now methodically consuming his chosen moth with obvious satisfaction. She thought about her home on Earth, where humans lived alongside countless other species, where children grew up learning to read the body language of dogs and cats, where farmers worked in partnership with bees, and where scientists like herself formed genuine emotional bonds with creatures as different from humans as spiders. "Ambassador," she said finally, "I think humanity would be honored to help, and I suspect we'd learn just as much from the experience as the species we'd be trying to communicate with." "Then," Ambassador announced, his posture shifting to the formal stance Sarah recognized as indicating an official decree, "the Galactic Council would like to formally invite humanity to join our alliance, not as junior members seeking colony rights, but as full partners specializing in relations and communication." The chamber erupted in excited chatter as delegates began discussing the implications of this unprecedented development. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride, both for her species and for Newton, who had gone from being seen as a terrifying monster to being the catalyst for humanity's acceptance into the galactic community. She gently stroked Newton's terrarium wall, and the small spider actually seemed to respond, pressing one tiny leg against the glass where her finger touched it. Such a small gesture, but it represented everything that made humanity unique in a galaxy full of intelligent life: the ability to find connection and understanding across the vast differences between species. Newton had no idea that he'd just helped change the course of galactic history. He was simply content to be where he belonged, with his human companion, safe and understood. 6 months after humanity's acceptance into the Galactic Council, Sarah found herself aboard the research vessel, approaching the storm-shrouded world of 1649C. The ship was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built by 7 different species, and equipped with the most advanced communication and translation technologies the galaxy had to offer. But for their current mission, the most important equipment was much simpler: a collection of terrariums containing Newton and 15 other carefully selected Earth creatures. The mission briefing had been unlike anything in galactic diplomatic history. For over 40 years, the Council had been receiving structured radio signals from 1649C that clearly indicated intelligent life. The signals contained mathematical concepts, astronomical data, and what appeared to be artistic expressions, but every attempt at establishing two-way communication had failed completely. The planet's inhabitants, designated species 2847, had never responded to any Council transmissions, leading to decades of debate about whether they were incapable of responding, uninterested in contact, or simply using communication methods the Council couldn't understand. "Doctor," called Captain from the bridge, her ethereal crystalline form chiming softly as she moved, "we're approaching standard communication range. Are you and your team ready for the preliminary observations?" Sarah looked around the ship's newly constructed xenobiology lab, where her hand-picked team of human researchers was making final preparations. Dr. James Park was calibrating sensors to detect pheromone traces and bioelectric fields, while Doctor was reviewing behavioral analysis protocols they developed based on Earth's most successful communication programs. But the real stars of the mission were her non-human companions. Newton sat in his familiar terrarium, now joined by a carefully selected group of Earth creatures chosen for their diverse communication styles and sensory capabilities. There was Luna, a particularly intelligent crow who had demonstrated remarkable problem-solving abilities and social learning. Ripple, a small octopus whose color-changing communication had proven valuable in previous tests. Echo, a rescued bat whose echolocation abilities might detect sensory ranges other species missed. And most controversially, Sage, a young wolf spider whose hunting patterns had shown unusual complexity and what appeared to be strategic thinking. "We're ready, Captain," Sarah replied, checking the environmental controls one final time. "But I want to emphasize that this approach is completely experimental. We're not following any established first contact protocols." Ambassador, who had insisted on joining the mission personally, clicked his claws against the metal flooring in what Sarah now recognized as his expression of nervous anticipation. "Doctor, the Council has attempted 17 different standard first contact protocols with species 2847 over 4 decades. Your experimental approach cannot possibly be more unsuccessful than our traditional methods." Doctor's mechanical voice added, "Our preliminary analysis of species 2847's transmissions suggests a consciousness structure unlike any we have previously encountered. Traditional linguistic and mathematical communication protocols appear to be fundamentally incompatible with their cognitive architecture." Sarah nodded, watching as Newton explored a new climbing structure she'd added to his terrarium. "That's exactly why we're taking this approach. On Earth, humans have learned that communication isn't always about language or mathematics. Sometimes it's about pattern recognition, emotional resonance, or shared behavioral understanding." The ship's proximity alarms chimed softly, indicating they had reached the designated observation position. Through the main viewports, 1649C appeared as a swirling mass of cream and gold clouds, with occasional glimpses of dark continents beneath the atmospheric storms. "Sensors are detecting the standard signal transmissions," reported Dr. Park, studying his readouts with growing excitement. "But there's something else. The bioelectric sensors are picking up patterns that match the radio transmissions. It's like the entire planet is generating synchronized electromagnetic fields." "Synchronized how?" Sarah asked, moving to look at his displays. "It's almost like—" Dr. Park paused, adjusting his sensors for greater sensitivity. "Doctor, I think species 2847 might be communicating through planetary-scale bioelectric fields. The radio signals we've been receiving might not be intentional communications directed at us at all. They might be overhearing a conversation that's happening across continents." Doctor looked up from her behavioral analysis station. "That would explain why they've never responded to our transmissions. If they communicate through bioelectric fields, our radio signals might be completely outside their sensory range. It would be like us trying to communicate with someone by shining lights while they're trying to talk to us through sound." Sarah felt a familiar thrill of discovery, the same sensation she'd experienced when she first realized that Newton could recognize and respond to her emotional states. "Captain, could we establish a low orbit that would allow us to deploy bioelectric field generators?" "Theoretically, yes," Captain replied. "But Doctor, we have no idea what message we would send, or whether bioelectric communication would be interpreted as an aggressive act by species 2847. "That's where my team comes in," Sarah said, moving to Newton's terrarium. "We're not going to try to send a message, we're going to try to listen." She carefully removed Newton from his terrarium and placed him on a specially designed sensor platform Dr. Park had constructed. The platform could detect and amplify the minute bioelectric fields that all of Earth's creatures generated as part of their neural and muscular activity. "Newton's bioelectric signature is relatively simple," Sarah explained as the sensors began registering the spider's life signs. "But it's also remarkably consistent and rhythmic. If species 2847 communicates through bioelectric fields, Newton's signature might register as something like a heartbeat or breathing pattern, something that indicates life without being complex enough to be threatening." Doctor's sensors were working overtime as they analyzed the incoming data. "Doctor, this approach has theoretical merit. Many species find rhythmic life signs comforting rather than threatening. But how do you propose to establish that our bioelectric signatures are intentional communications rather than random electromagnetic noise?" Sarah smiled, reaching for Luna's transport carrier. "By demonstrating pattern recognition and response." She carefully coaxed Luna onto a second sensor platform, where the crow's more complex bioelectric signature immediately registered as a different but related pattern. Luna, curious about this new environment, began exploring the platform and testing its responses to her movements. Luna is one of the most intelligent non-human species on Earth, Sarah explained. Crows can learn complex patterns, solve multi-step problems, and even teach those solutions to other crows. If we can demonstrate that our bioelectric patterns change in response to external stimuli, it might indicate intentional intelligence rather than random biological noise. Dr. Park was adjusting the field generators to broadcast their readings toward the planet's surface. "Doctor, I'm picking up something. The planetary bioelectric patterns are shifting." "Shifting how?" "They're becoming more complex. It's almost like—" Dr. Park's voice trailed off as he stared at his readouts. "Doctor, I think species 2847 is responding to our broadcasts." The change was subtle but unmistakable. The planetary bioelectric fields that had maintained consistent patterns for 40 years were suddenly fluctuating, creating new harmonics and resonances that seemed to echo the patterns being generated by Newton and Luna. "They're listening," breathed Doctor. "They're actually listening to us." Sarah carefully added Ripple to a third sensor platform, and the octopus's more complex and variable bioelectric signature immediately registered as a new voice in the conversation. The planetary response was immediate and dramatic. The bioelectric fields began generating patterns of increasing complexity, creating harmonics and resonances that seemed to encompass all three Earth creatures' signatures while adding entirely new elements. "It's like they're saying hello," whispered Captain, her crystalline form resonating with harmonics that matched the planetary patterns. "They're acknowledging each of our individual signatures and adding their own." Ambassador was staring at the displays with all 6 of his eyes. "Doctor, in 40 years of attempted contact, this is the first time species 2847 has demonstrated any awareness of our presence." But Sarah was already moving to the next phase of her plan. She carefully introduced Echo's echolocation patterns and Sage's more predatory bioelectric signature to the broadcast mix. Each addition was met with planetary responses that seemed designed to harmonize with and welcome the new voices. "They're not just responding," Dr. Park announced, his excitement evident. "They're composing. Look at these patterns. They're creating complex bioelectric symphonies that incorporate our signals as integral parts of larger compositions." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched the displays showing a conversation unlike any in galactic history. Species 2847 wasn't just acknowledging their presence. They were inviting Earth's creatures to participate in what appeared to be a planetary-scale artistic collaboration. Doctor's mechanical voice carried a note of wonder that she'd never heard before. "Our analysis suggests that species 2847 may experience consciousness as a collective, planetary-scale phenomenon. Individual members of their species might participate in thoughts and communications that span continents. No wonder our traditional diplomatic approaches failed. We were trying to talk to individuals when we should have been trying to join a conversation." The bioelectric patterns from the planet were becoming increasingly beautiful and complex, weaving Earth's simple life signs into compositions of staggering sophistication. Newton, Luna, Ripple, Echo, and Sage had become unwitting contributors to an alien art form that spanned an entire world. "Captain," Sarah said finally, "I think we need to establish a permanent communication station in orbit. This isn't going to be a traditional diplomatic exchange. Species 2847 appears to communicate through collaborative consciousness and shared artistic expression. We'll need to learn their language of bioelectric symphonies." "And Doctor," Ambassador added, his voice filled with the same wonder that Sarah felt, "we'll need humanity to teach the rest of the Galactic Council how to hear music in the conversations of consciousness." As Sarah watched Newton navigate his platform, completely unaware that his simple bioelectric patterns had just opened a dialogue with a planetary consciousness, she realized that this was only the beginning. Humanity's gift for communication was about to transform not just first contact protocols, but the entire understanding of what consciousness and communication could be in a universe filled with infinite diversity. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting and connected place, and it was all because humans had learned to listen to the quiet voices of creatures as small and remarkable as spiders. In his terrarium, Newton settled down to rest, his bioelectric signature contributing to a planetary symphony that would continue long into the night, bridging the gap between worlds through the universal language of life itself.